Hi, I'm going to tell you a story, and this story is not like any other story that you've heard. That's because this story is a sacred story. It's an ancient story, and it goes back all the way to the beginning of time. It's a story of how the world began. It's also a story of how we got to where we are now and where we one day will be. You see, the world was not always as it is today. There was a time in which the world was such that everybody loved everybody. It was a time of peace. It was a time of joy. It was a time of exuberant love for one another and love for our Creator, God. It was a time in which human beings took care of one another, they took care of the world, and there was contentment. But in this story, we realize and come to know that humanity rejected this pristine, perfect world for a more thrilling offer. They chose to believe a lie, fed to them by, well, the author of all lies, the devil, or Satan. And when they chose this lie and acted on it, it threw this world into a chaotic mess. People began to hate one another. People began to be jealous of one another. People began to hurt one another. Disease entered the world. Death entered the world. Suffering entered the world. And humanity fell into a very, very dark place. Over time, men, women, everyone gave themselves over to their feelings of shame and fear and guilt and jealousy and anger and hatred. And it looked like all was lost. But God's love was greater than humanity's rebellion. God had a plan. And at first, what God did was look onto the world to see if anyone still would trust Him, would believe in Him. And God found someone. His name was Abraham. And God gave Abraham a very special promise. He said, through you and through your descendants, Abraham, because you trust me, I will fix this world. I will recreate it so that there will be no more suffering or death. And I will dwell among humanity and this world once again. And so, through Abraham, God began to work His promise. And that promise was given to Abraham's son, Isaac. And Isaac passed that promise on to his son, Jacob. And eventually, the descendants of Jacob became a great nation and were delivered by God from slavery into a certain place in the world. This nation is called Israel. And through Israel, God was going to fulfill the promise that He gave to Abraham. He would dwell among humanity again. Humanity would learn to love one another, and God would use Israel as a way to demonstrate to the world His goodness. Unfortunately, like the first generation of humanity, Israel rejected God. And they too fell into the same darkness that the first generation of humans did. But it did not deter God. God was still speaking to Israel to fulfill that promise, and He chose different individuals, we call them prophets, that would speak on behalf of God. And through the prophets, God revealed that He would send a certain person, a king, someone to bring humanity back together, one with God. A king that would also redeem Israel, a king that they would wait for. And so Israel waited, and they waited, and they waited. And when the time was right, God chose a woman a woman that would trust God and believe in God. And through this woman, her name was Mary, he brought his son, God's own son, into this world. Even though Mary had never been with a man, she became pregnant through the Spirit of God and gave birth to a son. His name, Hebrew, Yeshua. In English, we call him Jesus. And when Jesus grew to be a man, he started proclaiming that the fulfillment of this promise of God had now taken place. The kingdom of God is now here. And Jesus did many things to demonstrate his authority, that he came from God. He healed many people. He did many, many miracles. He preached and he taught about this kingdom, and people were drawn to him. Ultimately, Jesus, in obedience to God, surrendered himself to a sham court and surrendered himself to wicked men who killed him by putting him on a cross and crucifying him. And all of his followers thought that all was lost, that once again fear had won, rage had won, evil had won. But God had a different plan. 3 days after Jesus was killed, God raised him from the dead. And while he came back from the dead, he was resurrected, meaning he was the same person but also different. He was a resurrected individual. And it gave an indication of one day when God will resurrect everyone and make all things new. And through faith and trust in him, we now have access to this kingdom. We have access to this hope. We now, through what God did in and through Jesus Christ, can live in the very presence of God. We, as in every generation leading up to us, have been given the gift of living in the power and strength and hope and peace of God's resurrection. One day, Jesus told his disciples, after he left this world and went back into the heavenly realm, I will return and I will fix this whole world. There will be no more death. There will be no more hatred, no more evil, no more pain, no more suffering. I will recreate the world so that the living God will once again dwell with humanity with an outpouring of love. And all things will be made new. That is how the story will end. And my friends, I pray and hope that this story resonates with you, because it is a true story of this world. And I pray that it sparks something within you, that it stirs something within you, that you want to know more about this story, because in doing so, you will discover a joy and a hope that this world cannot offer. My hope is that you lean into this story and learn that you and God is calling you to be part of it. That's the story of all mankind. I hope that you find the story intriguing, because the story, God's story, can touch us on levels that no other story can. It reveals a truth about who we are, why we're here, where we will be throughout eternity. And so, if you're interested in learning more about God's story, I invite you to go to the next video, which talks about and reveals God's written story, known as the Bible.